الله ولي الذين آمنوا يخرجهم من الظلمات إلى النور.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على خير المرسلين محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you again for joining us here in the shade of Ramadan. Today, inshallah, we're going to be talking about guarding the tongue. This is especially relevant to us fasting this month of Ramadan. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he advised us that the one who does not leave false speech and false actions, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not need him to leave his food and drink. And also, there's a story in the Prophet's time where two women were fasting and they were complaining of the pain in their stomach. So they sent a message to the Prophet Muhammad and they asked him, "Are we allowed to break our fast?" And in his response to them, he sent a bowl and he asked them to vomit into the bowl. Each woman had not eaten anything, and yet when the bowl was presented to them, each woman vomited and filled half the bowl. And what was in the bowl was meat. And the Prophet ﷺ told us that these two women, they had been fasting and yet they were backbiting. He said that they avoided what was ordinarily permissible and they indulged in what was ordinarily forbidden. And again, this is how backbiting or ill speech can actually ruin someone's fast. So it's very relevant for us today and in the month of Ramadan. Inshallah, we're going to address 3 roots of ill speech. The first root of ill speech is actually something very simple. And we find the evidence for it in the Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Hujurat,
يا أيها الذين آمنوا اجتنبوا كثيرا من الظن إن بعض الظن إثم ولا تجسسوا ولا يغتب بعضكم بعضا أيحب أحدكم أن يأكل لحم أخيه ميتا فكرهتموه واتقوا الله إن الله تواب رحيم.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in this verse, before he tells us not to backbite, he tells us not to be suspicious and not to spy. So the root of ill speech, before you even talk about what's coming out of your tongue, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is addressing what's coming into our minds, suspicion and spying. So in order to prevent ill speech, we have to prevent those ill thoughts. And the shaitan, as we know, is the one who puts those thoughts in our heads. And a lot of times we as Muslims make the mistake. When the waswasa comes, we think that's actually us. And that's not us, that's a whisper from the shaitan. And we can protect ourselves from that by saying A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem every time we think something that we know is actually very bad. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ also advised us, do not transgress your Muslim brother either in thought or in action. By thinking something bad of him, that's actually a form of transgression. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he advised us against that. Again, it's ill thoughts that lead to ill speech. The second root of ill speech is unnecessary talking. Not everything that passes through our mind should be coming out of our mouth. In a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to Mu'adh bin Jabal while he was a youth, after describing the pillars of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad asked him, "Do you know what holds all this together?" And Mu'adh asked, "What?" And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, "Control this." And he held his tongue between his hands. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, subhanAllah, he always advised us about speech, and he was the best example of good speech. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about the importance of this speech, of good speech, when he talks about Jannah. And he tells us that there's actually no vain speech in Jannah. There's no ill language. He says, لا يسمعون فيها لغوا ولا تأثيما, that nobody will hear vain speech in Jannah. And this is actually one of the rewards of being in paradise. So the question becomes, what is ill speech? What is lagw? And when we think about it, is it just lying? Is it just gossiping? Is it just trying not to be rude? Is it just trying not to cuss? Or does it also include trying not to talk too much unnecessarily? Sometimes we find that we are hurting our hearts because there will be a large quantity of non-beneficial speech that is having an effect on hardening our hearts. So just because there's not necessarily something blatantly haram in it, but if it's in large quantity, it can still have a negative impact on our hearts. And that's a very important thing for us to remember. If we want to find an example of those who tried to restrain their speech, we need only to look at the example of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. In this story, he was actually seen pulling his tongue, and Umar radiallahu anhu came up to him and said, "What are you doing? May Allah forgive you." And Abu Bakr answered Umar, and he said, "This tongue has led me to dangerous places." And we have to think, if Abu Bakr, the best man who is not a prophet, who walked this earth, is worried about his speech, then what about you and I? What about the average person who is living in our time? What about the students in high school who hear ill speech all the time and are trying very hard not to incorporate it as part of their vocabulary? The third root cause of ill speech is that we don't intentionally try to have good conversation. We don't intentionally try, whenever we're meeting our Muslim brothers and sisters, we just go with the flow. And it's an act of ibadah actually to try to help the iman of your fellow Muslim brother or your fellow Muslim sister by trying to keep the speech good. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be talking about the Quran or you have to be mentioning hadith all the time, but just to talk about things that are beneficial. And those types of conversations are quality conversations, and those types of friendships are quality friendships. A really wonderful example, actually, of trying to practice good speech is also seen in the same example of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu and Umar radiallahu anhu. I was really amazed actually when I read the story about them, because this happened during the time of the economic boycott. Umar and Abu Bakr were sitting and they were talking about some verses of the Quran at this time when the Muslims were suffering, at this time when the Muslims were hungry, just like you and I are hungry right now. And actually, what they were sitting and talking about, two friends, where they were talking and discussing about some verses of the Quran. And subhanAllah, Umar says that while they were discussing these verses of the Quran and talking about its meaning together, they both fell unconscious out of the pains of hunger and starvation. And the reason why this story touched me is not necessarily because they fell unconscious, not necessarily because the hunger was so great, but I was thinking, subhanAllah, two friends just sitting around and talking about the Quran. You know, it doesn't have to be a halaqah to talk about something beneficial. It doesn't have to be an Islamic program to talk about something that's good. You don't have to be in a classroom to benefit from your fellow Muslim brothers and sisters and the knowledge that they have. This can be done every day in regular conversations. So really make an effort to have good speech, and you will have no taste in your mouth for the ill speech. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us of those who have clean tongues and make us of those who try to practice good speech. Jazakumullah khair again for joining us today in the shade of Ramadan.